today, of course, we have another sort of transition in our reading of Atonement. Right? Last time we saw that the culmination, the point that McEwen was building up to in part 1 finally occurred in our reading last time, particularly chapter 13, where we saw the attack on Lola and the accusation by Bryony that it was Robbie who did it. Right? And then today we read the following chapter, chapter 14, which is the last of part 1, and then a few pages of part 2. Right? Where did we stop at part 2? Was it at the end of a chapter?
Chapter? No.
No, it wasn't, was it? Is there a chapter 1 in part 2? So we can see that already part 2 is structured, written differently than part 1, right? What happened in part 1 whenever we changed chapters?
Perspectives changed.
Right, so we would jump between the perspectives of different characters. So in one moment it would be Bryony's perspective, and then we'd see through the eyes of, say, Cecilia, or Robbie, or Emily Tallis, or the twins, and Lola, right? But each time we had a chapter, most of the time we spent that movement from one chapter to the next, jumping between different perspectives, right? So we can see already that there is a change in not so much the style, because what voice, what perspective is this part 2 written in? First person? Still third person, isn't it, right? And part 1 was written in third person narrative, right? So we said from the beginning of our course, it's always important to take a notice of which perspective or which voice a story is written in. Is it first person? Is it third person? And that makes a difference in how we read and understand and look at the bias of the narrative, right? So part 2 is still third person, right? We still have an outside narrator who is telling us the thoughts and ideas and actions and so on of the character. However, we don't have the chapter structure that we had in part 1, right? Where we jumped between the different perspectives of the characters, right? Now, as we go along, you'll see that the reason for this is that part 2 pretty much has its focus on one of the characters that we've met so far, and that is the character of Robbie, right? So even though we are introduced and we also come back to other characters, at the same time, the main focus of part 2 is there on Robbie, okay? All right, so there is this change, as I said, in the perspective. No more chapters, no more jumping between perspectives from one character to the next. That's only part 1. Part 2, part 3, they have this single focus, single perspective. Still third person, but from this focus, single focus on a character. Okay. All right. Now, since we're beginning or delving into this next part of the novel, I want to go back to some of the passages and some of the ideas to make sure that we didn't miss some crucial things, or that there are things that we now know about that if we were to talk about them earlier, I would have been giving away parts of the plot, right? So there's certain things, certain references that I want to come back to, certain ways in which the novel is structured, certain things that McEwen talks about that when we look back, right? And I've read this, I can't count how many times I've read this novel, actually probably 6 or 7 times. So every time I read it, I already know what's going to happen. But each time also, because it's such a well-written novel, I also notice new things every time that I read it. So one of the things that I've mentioned a couple of times before, but I want to focus more attention on, is the use of time that we've seen so far in the novel. Part 1 is set when? What year? 1935, during the summer, yes, right? And how many weeks? 1 day, right? That's a trick question, all right? So just 1 day. And notice we're about halfway through the novel. So part 1 takes up about half of the novel, and it's just 1 single day. So, of course, this allows McEwan to go into a great deal of detail in focusing on just this 1 day. We're able to delve quite deeply into the characters and who they are and what they're thinking and what they're doing, right? And so all these things that we've seen, from the morning when Bryony is planning the trials of Arabella, all through the evening when they have the get-together, and of course, at nighttime, we've seen chapters 13 and 14 where the twins run off, Lola is attacked, Robbie is accused, Robbie returns with the twins, etc. Right. All that is basically around 1 day, 24 hours. So McEwan is able to focus in very carefully on the details, give us, things from that time period. We've seen there are lots of sort of cultural references that he's able to bring up, right? He's able to talk about how the way in which people thought about certain things in 1935 in Great Britain then is different to how they would think today, right? So we talk particularly about things like the position of women, right? And Cecilia's dilemma as to what she's going to do and also what she's done, and how even her mother judges her for the way in which she thinks and behaves as being this new young woman, right? And I've mentioned before, McEwan is not doing this for like the first time ever in literature, right? There are, as we'll see, a number of references to the way in which earlier authors have written stories, famous stories, that are structured around this idea of portraying the whole of a lifetime, or trying to capture the whole of a person, or a portrait of a person in the space of just 1 day. All right? Now, most particularly, as it says there, this is done in the modernist novel. And modernism is a movement that is, like other earlier movements, like Romanticism and so on, is a very broad movement that encompasses a lot of different styles and so on. But basically, if you think about it, it's the movement that characterizes art and literature from let's say, roughly the first half of the 20th century, right? So there are very famous artists who are working in this very experimental style, right? So think of very famous painters like Salvador Dali, right, with his dreamscapes and so on, or Pablo Picasso, whom we've seen mentioned earlier even in our story, right? Remember Picasso playing with the perspective, trying to paint 3D onto a 2D canvas, right? Trying to do all sorts of experiments like that. Also too, in literature, the modernists tried to do new and different things in the way in which they wrote about the world, about characters, about how people think, right? So one of the ways in which they did this, for instance, was that they tried to represent the way in which our actual flow of thoughts works, right? When you meet characters, say in a 19th century novel, right, the way in which they think and the way in which they speak, we tend to see very much the surface of things, right? They speak very clearly, confidently, articulately, right? Whereas Is that how we actually think? No, right? Our brains wander, we think about things that aren't relevant, and say, oh yeah, oh that reminds me, and we have memories of things that we have. So all these different ways in which our brain sort of wanders around, has incomplete thoughts, thinks about things that aren't relevant, doesn't think in complete thoughts, right? All of these things the modernists tried to capture in a famous style known as stream of consciousness, right? So basically it's almost like trying to open up the brain of a human being and see, oh, look, this is how someone thinks, or trying to represent that in literature. So, as I said, that's one strategy. Another strategy was to take one day in the life of someone, and through these thoughts, through their actions, through their relationships, you get to see a glimpse of their whole life, of what they've done with their life, of their past, of what they think of themselves, of their memories, of all the things that have created them in that moment. So, some famous examples. Two of the most famous modernist novels, for instance. First of all, James Joyce's Ulysses. Right? You can see that this is the first edition. It's a big, fat, long book. Right? Published in 1922. Very difficult to read. Often hard to follow the narrative, because Joyce does things like he uses that stream of consciousness style, so we see inside the minds of the characters, and sometimes we can't tell, is this the person thinking a thought? Are they doing it? Is it just the narrator saying this? Right? All of these ambiguities about the way in which the texts are written come through in this book. Right? And it tells the life of Leopold Bloom, an Irishman in Dublin, on one day, June 16th, in this book, right? And Ulysses, of course, is the famous Greek hero, and the way in which Joyce borrows the storyline of Ulysses as a parallel to the relatively unheroic life of his main character, right? Remember Odysseus, or Ulysses in the Greek myth, right? He's coming home from the Trojan War, but instead of just going straight home, which would have been a fairly quick journey, remember he gets sidetracked and he goes on all sorts of different adventures, and he gets trapped in different places and so on, and it takes him 20 years to get home because of all the adventures and all the sidetracking and all of the angry guards that try to stop him from getting home, all the obstacles he has to overcome on his journey home. Well, those are all reused as part of the sort of everyday adventure that Leopold Bloom has in the streets of Dublin. Okay, another very famous modernist work is Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and we'll see later on in Atonement that Virginia Woolf is cited directly as being an influence upon the way in which this novel is written, right? That her style of representing, again, the flow of thoughts of her characters, their memories and so on. And I mention this particularly so far with regard to Emily Tallis, right, the mother. Right? Her flow of thoughts, the way in which she thinks, her associations, her memories, her opinions, right? The way in which this is presented is very, very similar to the style of Virginia Woolf, right? Just like I mentioned that the scene in the library, the love scene between Robbie and Cecilia borrows from D.H. Lawrence, so too McEwan borrows the style of Virginia Woolf, and we'll see why later on, right? It's revealed to us. So, this novel, Mrs. Dalloway, it looks long, but actually it's a very short little novel, and I don't know why it looks so long in the first edition, but very short little novel, and again, one day in the life of Mrs. Dalloway in this case. All right. Mention one other. This time it's a fairly long short story from this collection, The Garden Party and Other Stories by Catherine Mansfield. She was friends with Virginia Woolf and D.H. Lawrence and the other famous modernist writers. And again, this story and also a companion piece that she wrote for another short story that has the same characters and the same setting all take place again in the space of one day, right? So there's this idea of getting a glimpse into the life of a character just through looking at one day, through their thoughts, their memories, opinions, and so on, relationships, etc. And I should mention there's one other writer who's done this as well. In the novel that he published after Atonement, right? I mentioned last time the novel he published before Atonement, Enduring Love, which opens with the hot air balloon accident, right? Which is sort of the equivalent of Bryony's accusation, right? Remember, Bryony's accusation sets off a chain of problems and emotions and so on that are the centerpiece of the novel. So too that hot air balloon, right? It also, hot air balloon accident has that same effect, except it comes right at the beginning of Enduring Love. In McEwan's next novel, Saturday, it begins early in the morning when the main character wakes up suddenly, can't sleep, right? Goes to the window, thinks he sees some sort of a plane having some sort of problems, right? And then we track his thoughts and his emotions and his actions and so on all through the rest of that one day, right? So again, this strategy, one day in the life, right? Allowing us to see a lifetime, but within this very limited sort of space, right? So obviously what that does to us, when we think about the nature of time, does a day seem very long to us as a rule? Days go by quickly, don't they? Right? And yet, at the same time, we can see from these texts that if we look closely at the days of the characters and even of our own lives, there are certain things that they tell us about our lives, even though the space is short and our lives seem longer by comparison. Right? But then that also gets us to think about, as many of the modernists are, the shortness of life too. All right. Go. Now, I mentioned this before, that remember at the end of chapter 3, we have that moment where the story suddenly jumps forward, right? Remember chapter 3, the focus is on Bryony, right? This is where Bryony is trying to sort of like think about her own actions and her own responsibility. Remember, she stands there sort of like looking at her fingers and saying, oh, how do I do that? Like, is that me thinking that? Or is there something else that's making my fingers move, right? And she's starting to think about like what causes me to act in a certain way, right? And as she thinks about these things, we suddenly, at the end of the chapter, we jump forward. And we're told, you know, about Bryony 6 decades later. She's become a famous novelist. She's tried with all these different writing styles, and she's settled upon this particular style called psychological realism, right? But notice too that in the later chapters of part 1, we start to get little jumps forward as well, right? So we get these little moments where we get the narrator, instead of just describing the events that are happening and saying, you know, Robbie thinks this, and then Cecilia did that, and Bryony said this, right? Instead, we have these little moments where we have the narrator looking back and giving their opinion on things from obviously a perspective from much later, right? So this particularly happens in chapter 13 and chapter 14. These, of course, are the pivotal chapters in which Bryony makes her accusations against Robbie, right? And you can see it's signaled right at the very beginning of chapter 13. Right at the very beginning. Look at that first sentence there of chapter 13 on page 84 in our packet. Within the half hour, Bryony would commit her crime. Right? So this is obviously someone who knows things about the future, but because they're looking back at this from the past. Right? They're looking back at this from the past, and they start to make these little judgments and these little statements about the way in which Bryony behaves during those chapters. Right? Not all the time, just little moments, little parts where the narrator jumps into the narrative and gives their opinion or gives their voice to certain ideas and certain ways of interpreting the events that are happening. So in particular, there is this section on page 92 to 93 in our packet. Right? Which again, we can see it's someone looking back at the past, right? The narrator looking back at the past and thinking about what happened, right? Because remember, for the most part, we've seen this being described as it's happening, right? The accusations, what Bryony's saying, what Lola says, how the family treats all of this, the policeman, all that stuff. Right? It's being told to us as it's unfolding. But in this paragraph, we're looking back. Right? We're looking back to see the opinions of the narrator of what happened and how they're interpreting it. So, read out. She would never be able to console herself that she was pressured or bullied. She never was. She trapped herself. She marched into the labyrinth of her own construction and was too young, too awestruck, too keen to please, to insist on making her own way back. She was not endowed with or old enough to possess such independence of spirit. An imposing congregation had massed itself around her first certainties, and now it was waiting, and she could not disappoint it at the altar, right? As if she's marrying these ideas, right? Her doubts could be neutralized only by plunging in deeper. By clinging tightly to what she believed she knew, narrowing her thoughts, reiterating her testimony, she was able to keep from mind the damage she only dimly sensed she was doing. When the matter was closed, when the sentence was passed, and the congregation dispersed, a ruthless, youthful forgetting, a willful erasing protected her well into her teens. So remember, she's 13 now, right? So this is saying, like, looking back, this is how she viewed it. It was like she was marrying these ideas, right? That's why she says doesn't want to leave them at the altar, right? It's like she's marrying these ideas, and now she's stuck with them, and she then sort of erases any sort of feelings of guilt from her mind, as it says there, until she's well into her, so a few years later, we assume, right? So she's 13 now, let's say it's like 4, 5, 6 years, she's able to sort of feel like she didn't do anything wrong, right? But what that tells us is that those feelings of guilt that she has, that she's done something wrong, they're going to come back. So this sentence, or this paragraph here rather, tells us, right, that we have a narrator, again, instead of being within the moment, within the unfolding of these events as they're happening, suddenly we've jumped forward to a narrator who is looking back upon Bryony when she's younger, looking back at this character and thinking, well, this is what was happening, this is the consequences of her actions, this is how they started to unfold, right? And then thinking about time, we get to the end of part 1, right? we see the evening ends, the dawn comes about, right? We see that Robbie returns with the twins, right? He's found them. The accusations are made. It's morning. Part 1 ends, right, with Robbie being arrested. And then what happens with regard to time from part 1 to part 2? What happens? What's happening in part 2? What's going on? What's the historical context here? World War II, yeah. Is that in 1935? When does World War II begin? What year?
39.
Yes, 1939. So we know that at least 4 years, but a little bit more actually, 5 years, have passed. Right? So notice that this is a very important jump in terms of our thinking about time as well, is that we have focused on this one day in 1935. We spent the whole half of the novel, all we focused on, just those 24 hours or so. And then suddenly, gap, 5 years. And does McEwan even tell us? 5 years have passed. It's now, does he tell us that? No. We're just sort of, as readers, we're thrown into this new context, right? We're thrown into this new time, this new period. Okay. So these little strategies, as I said, they're designed to get us to think about time. They're designed to get us to think about our relationship to time and how we think about our lives unfolding in relation to time. The opportunities that we have, we've already seen the way in which this is important in terms of the ages of the characters, right? So we saw how, you know, the ages of Bryony and Lola are important for them wanting to be sort of like they're wanting to be adults, but they're still just only on the threshold of being adults. We've already seen that how this is important for both Robbie and Cecilia, as they now have just graduated from university and they're contemplating what are we going to do with our adult lives, right? And they have these, so, well, Cecilia is not sure, and that's part of her confusion and part of her uncertainty that we see in part 1, whereas Robbie has these dreams and visions as to what he's going to do, right? So those ages, the use of time, right, all these things are quite important. And then this very sudden jump into World War II several years later is deliberately done to kind of shock us. And whoa, wait a minute. 1 minute it was 1935 and it was all one day. Now it's already 1940 and like, what's going on, right? So it's a deliberate strategy by McEwan to sort of shake us up, right? To surprise us in jumping into part 2. All right. Now, there are a couple of references I also want to bring to your attention as we look back upon this part 1 of the novel. And as I said, some of these references are things that I wasn't going to reveal to you until we knew about Bryony's accusation, right? Because otherwise, you know, we would be giving away parts of the plot. Now, the first one comes from a scene right after Bryony has read Robbie's letter, right? And remember, after Bryony reads Robbie's letter, she feels very adult, right? She has this feeling, oh, my life has changed, my world has changed. I've been exposed to this naughty word, right? She thinks about that. And she's like, well, you know, if I know this word, I must be an adult now, right? And she says, this must change the way in which I write. And so she goes over to, you know, takes out her writing things, and she's going to write something. And the thing that she actually ends up writing is the first line from a nursery rhyme. Right? This is on page 61 of your course packet. So instead of writing her own story, she writes down this first line of a famous nursery rhyme. Not one that I grew up with, but quite famous. And that line is the first one you see there. There was an old lady who swallowed a fly. You can see it there on 61, right? Or 108 in this edition. Right? Let me read the nursery rhyme to you. There was an old lady who swallowed a fly. I don't know why she swallowed a fly. Perhaps she'll die. There was an old lady who swallowed a spider that wriggled and wiggled and tickled inside her. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly. I don't know why she swallowed a fly. Perhaps she'll die. There was an old lady who swallowed a bird. How absurd to swallow a bird. She swallowed the bird to catch the spider. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly. I don't know why she swallowed a fly. Perhaps she'll die. There was an old lady who swallowed a cat. Fancy that, to swallow a cat. She swallowed the cat to catch the bird. She swallowed the bird to catch the spider. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly. I don't know why she swallowed a fly. Perhaps she'll die. There was an old lady who swallowed a dog. What a hog to swallow a dog. She swallowed the dog to catch the cat. She swallowed the cat to catch the bird. She swallowed the bird to catch the spider. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly. I don't know why she swallowed the fly. Perhaps she'll die. There was an old lady who swallowed a cow. I don't know how she swallowed a cow. She swallowed the cow to catch the dog. She swallowed the dog to catch the cat. She swallowed the cat to catch the bird. She swallowed the bird to catch the spider. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly. I don't know why she swallowed a fly. Perhaps she'll die. There was an old lady who swallowed a horse. She's dead, of course. All right. Now, nursery rhymes, who usually is associated with, what kind of age do we associate with nursery rhymes? Think about the title. Think about the name. How old do you have to be? Old? Right, it's like when you're very young, right? In a nursery, right? A nursery is like a place for children, little children. So on the one hand, most of these nursery rhymes are for fun, right? They're for fun. And one of the things that this nursery rhyme does in practical terms is it's designed to help children to memorize things, right? Because you got to sort of memorize, okay, first she catches first it's a fly, then it's a spider, right? Then it's a bird, then it's a cat, then it's a dog, then it's a cow, then it's a horse, right? So notice each time the story is retold and something new is added, right? And the idea is that like children will learn to memorize, they'll use this as a device for memorization, right? So it helps to develop a child's memory, it has a practical function. But notice too that a lot of nursery rhymes also have a kind of moral message, right? What is this about?
A lady swallowed a fly.
Well, yes, that's the surface of it. Good. But the deeper idea, what does the nursery rhyme get us to think about? What does she do when she swallows a fly? What is her solution?
Solving another thing that will kill it, and like it's causing more problems.
Right. So each thing that she swallows is outside of her might be a solution, right? It might fix the problem, but at the same time it causes a bigger problem, right? So, a spider will kill a fly, but having a spider in you now is a bigger problem than having a fly. Swallowing the bird, well, the bird might kill the spider, but then now you have a bigger problem. And so each time the old lady tries to solve her problems, it starts with something very small, doesn't it? Right? And you think, well, just digest the fly, right? It's not that big a deal. I mean, it's kind of disgusting to swallow a fly, but, right? Now, as we said, there is not only is this for helping children memorize, but this message tells us, doesn't it? The message of this nursery rhyme is that when you're fixing something, when you make a mistake, don't make the mistake bigger by choosing solutions to the problem that will just make it worse, right? That's what that nursery rhyme is telling us. So how does this then, remember we talked many times about how authors put references in their literary text so that we compare their stories to what's going on in the reference, right? So if we think about this nursery rhyme and its message, and we compare it to what Bryony does, right? Okay. Then we can see that her lie, right? Her lie about Robbie, which she thinks is just, oh, it's just a small thing, right? I mean, he's a monster after all. He's a maniac. He's a bad guy. Right? It's just a small lie. Is like the old lady who is swallowing the fly, right? But it's a problem that gets bigger and bigger and bigger because, like the old lady, Bryony is not choosing something that would wisely take care of the problem, but by lying has done something that will actually make the problem bigger, right? So this is one of the references that I wanted to pick up. The second one, and I mentioned this author earlier in our course, but for the most part then I focused upon his other famous novel, that of Pamela, right? So Pamela, both of them have the names of the young women who are the heroines of the story. Right? And remember, we had a reference to virtue rewarded was the phrase that alerted us to Richardson earlier. And virtue rewarded was the subtitle of Pamela. And we saw that Pamela was the story of the young woman who is a servant in the house of an aristocrat, Mr. B. And Mr. B is a naughty man. He's a womanizer. He tries to sleep with every woman that he can. And he tries to do the same with Pamela, but she refuses. And he becomes more and more intrigued by her until the point where she's basically like, well, I'll sleep with you, but you have to marry me first, right? Put a ring on it, and I'll marry you. And so this is the sort of the idea of the story, the message, the moral message of Richardson's earlier story was about, you follow good female virtue, you'll be rewarded by getting to marry an aristocrat who has lots of money. Right? Life will reward you for your virtue. Now, his second novel, Clarissa, who was reading this novel? Cecilia, right? Remember, Cecilia is reading this and she mentions it a few times. For instance, the first time it's mentioned, she talks about it with Robbie, right? And she says, Clarissa, why am I reading this novel? Oh, it's so long and it's so boring. Oh, I hate this. I hate this heroine. I hate what she does. I hate what she stands for. Richardson, he just gets on my nerves, right? And Robbie sort of feels the need because he's read the book himself because he's a good English major and he does his homework, right? And he's read Clarissa, and he says, well, that's okay. Maybe you don't like it, but remember, there are certain virtues about Richardson. He has, very clear moral vision, and he has these interesting ideas. So, don't give up on him just yet. All right. So that's one instance. Okay. A second instance is when she's talking to her brother Leon, and she's getting more frustrated with the novel of Clarissa. She says, as for Clarissa, all those daylight hours curled up on the bed with pins and needles in her arm. Right? She's not literally having pins and needles in her arm. This is the phrase that Americans call it when your limbs go to sleep. Right? If you lie on your arm for too long, or your legs go numb. Right? Americans call that your limbs going to sleep. In Great Britain and Australia, we call it pins and needles, because when you finally move your arm or leg and it's gone to sleep, then it feels like there's pins and needles sticking into it. Right? That's what that means. With pins and needles in her arm, it surely proved the case of Paradise Lost in reverse. The heroine became more loathsome as her death-fixated virtue was revealed. Leon nodded and pursed his lips. He would not pretend to know what she was talking about, nor would he interrupt. So, she explains about, here we have Cecilia trying to explain about Clarissa, and she's obviously read a whole lot more since she talked to Robbie, right? Or she has read more than she lets on about than earlier, because she seems to be quite a long way into the novel. Right? And Leon's like, yeah, it sounds boring, right? Yeah, okay, right? And he just is, he's not a very intelligent guy. He's just sort of laid back. He's like, yeah, sorry, sister, sounds like your novel isn't all that good, right? Now, one thing I didn't tell you about was, though, the key parts of the plot of Clarissa. Because just as we saw that some of the other texts that McEwan has referenced, like Twelfth Night, like Lady Chatterley's Lover, as we focused on the other day, so too he borrows certain elements from the story of Clarissa. And I didn't tell you about these earlier because, again, they would have ruined the surprise of certain parts of the story that we hadn't read yet. Okay, now, Clarissa, again, is about a young woman who is looking to try and make her way in the world, and she's from the Harlow family, and she's trying to, so her family name, Harlow, Clarissa Harlow, and she is, she wants to, her family wants to rise in the world and to become upper class, right? And it's thought that she would marry this, perhaps this young man by the name of Lovelace, Richard Lovelace. However, her brother ends up picking a fight with Lovelace, and their families become mortal enemies. Nonetheless, Lovelace still wants to marry Clarissa, and so he kidnaps her, and he keeps her locked up. Actually, keeps her locked up in a brothel, like with all the prostitutes and so on. And Clarissa, like Pamela, she's a virtuous young woman. She's a good young woman, right? But there's a difference in the way the story turns out. Pamela manages to convince Mr. B to marry her, and there's a happy ending. Whereas Clarissa turns out to be more tragic, unhappy ending. And again, Lovelace continually tries to encourage Clarissa to marry him, to be with him, to sleep with him, whatever he can get from her. Right? And she refuses. And so instead of just keeping at it like Mr. B does, he drugs her and rapes her. Right? Thinking, oh, well, now that she's lost her virginity and given the morals of the time, right? Now that she's a ruined woman, according to the morals of the 18th century, she'll have to marry me, right? She'll realize that I've raped her, she'll become my wife, that'll be the end of it, right? So notice that this is, again, right? And think about the rape of Clarissa, the parallel here, the attack on Lola, right? Attempted rape of Lola. Now, this actually doesn't work for Lovelace, because Clarissa is like, I don't care that you raped me. No matter what you do now, I will never, ever, there's no chance in hell I would ever marry you. And so she escapes. She dies virtuously of a disease. And you know, the revenge is later taken upon Lovelace, and all sorts of other things happen in the novel. It's a very, very, very long novel. Okay, so when Cecilia is talking about this heroine as being this death-fixated virtue, right? Here we have this character of Clarissa. She's been kidnapped, she's been drugged, she's been raped, and now she is acting, oh, I will always be virtuous. Even though you raped me, it's not my fault. I will be virtuous forever. And here is Cecilia's reaction to it. She's like, ugh, yeah, I can't stand this character. Oh, I hate Clarissa. Oh, yeah, okay, she was wrong. So Lovelace was wrong to rape her, but I have no sympathy for her. Right? Can't stand her. And Leon is like, yeah, I get what you mean. Right, yeah, how boring. Yeah, I don't get, yeah, how uninteresting. When we come back to this and look at this passage now, and we think about it in the context of what happens later, right? There is a great deal of irony in these reactions, isn't there? Right? Because when there's the attempted rape of Lola, do people react in the same way? They don't, do they? Right? Leon is one of the ones who leads, thinks, oh, the person who did this, who attacked Lola, should be punished. Right? This is outrageous. Here, when he hears about it in literature, he's like, oh, yeah, that sounds boring. Oh, why would anyone want to read that? Later, his reaction is quite different. So there is, again, this parallel between these two stories. That the story of Clarissa focusing upon the abduction, rape, and virtue, upstanding virtue of the young woman, and then in contrast, the way in which the attack on Lola, the reactions to that, how those are all framed, are all quite different, even though McEwan, by the reference, by Cecilia reading this book, is setting up this comparison between how we see those things. All right. Okay. All right. Okay, well, we're out of time, so thank you guys. Enjoy your weekend. I will see you on Monday for a continuation of part 2 as Robbie defeats the German army. All right. Single-handedly.